Welcome to Kroc at a Distance webinar, Innovative Collective Action, How People Respond with Courage and Creativity in Trying Times, co-hosted with the San Diego Diplomacy Council. I'm Krista Koch-John-Paler, Assistant Dean for Marketing and Advancement at the University of San Diego's Kroc School. The Kroc School was the first standalone school of peace studies established in the United States. Our institute and graduate programs are dedicated to creating and sustaining peaceful and just societies. We operate as an incubator of innovative ideas and research, which you'll hear an example of shortly. Our graduate programs are each ranked in the top 3 in their field, and our students, faculty, staff, and peacebuilding partners are solving humanity's urgent challenges today. We're excited to host this webinar. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items to share. We've set up this Zoom meeting with all the safety protocols at our disposal, but in the rare chance of our meeting being hacked, it's possible we'll end the meeting if other measures don't mitigate the disruption. We don't expect this and have not had this issue with our meetings. We've muted all participants. To ask a question, please use the chat box you see at the bottom of the screen. You can type in your questions during the entire presentation, then I'll curate and read them to our presenters during our discussion period. And finally, I wanted to let you know that this webinar will be recorded and made available for viewing after the live event. We're excited to partner with the San Diego Diplomacy Council on today's event. The San Diego Diplomacy Council connects world leaders across sectors with San Diego to build trust, dialogue, and collaboration, promoting global prosperity and peace. I would now like to introduce Fabienne Perlov, Executive Director of the San Diego Diplomacy Council, to share a few words before I introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Krista. We are delighted to partner with the Kroc School of Peace Studies today. This is really an opportunity to engage more community members and students in global conversation. The San Diego Diplomacy Council, like you indicated, Krista, is now more than ever committed to reinforce trust, dialogue, and collaborations between America and other nations to promote peace, but also to address common challenges like COVID-19. Our in-person international exchange programs have been on hold for 3 months now, but we are resilient and we are working hard to offer virtual weekly events to our community at home and abroad. And if you would like to join those events this week and next week, you're welcome to check our website at sandiegodiplomacy.org. Thank you, Krista. Now I will hand over the mic to you.
Great, thank you, Fabienne. Novel forms of collective action and protest emerge during crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic is no different. Kroc School professor Dr. Austin Choi-Fitzpatrick and his colleague Dr. Felipe Santos from the University of Manchester have worked with colleagues across the globe to document over 100 methods of nonviolent action during this time. That work was recently published in an article in The Guardian titled, "The global pandemic has spawned new forms of activism and they're flourishing." During this webinar, we'll hear their insider's view into current movements around the world. Austin, as a Kroc School professor, is a sociologist, and his work focuses on culture, politics, and technology, especially in relation to social movements. Felipe is a postdoctoral research associate at the Politics Department of the University of Manchester. His work focuses on social movements and protests, as well as how people react in moments of crisis. In 2018, he was a visiting scholar here at the Kroc School. They are 2 of 4 authors of the recent Guardian article. I'll now hand over the program to Austin Choi-Fitzpatrick and Felipe Santos.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us and thanks for the introduction. So this was actually, I'm very happy to talk about this because it was a really fun project. And I think that as it was your idea, Austin, why don't you tell everyone how this idea came from and how we made it happen?
Yeah, I'm supposed to be driving a slide deck with a couple of slides, but instead I'm super duper distracted because I didn't take the advice and look at this in speaker view. I'm looking at it and seeing everybody's faces. So I just want to I'm pointing at everybody and saying hello. So it's good to see so many faces here and to have so many folks show up to talk about something that I think is super duper important and is the reason why Felipe and I and our colleagues are doing this thing in the first place, because these are unusual times and I think it calls for unusual sorts of energies from universities. So we're talking today because I and Felipe and some colleagues, Erica Chenoweth at Harvard and Jeremy Pressman at the University of Connecticut, wrote this piece about 2 weeks ago, or it came out about 2 weeks ago in The Guardian, asking what forms of collective action, either protest or sort of solidarity efforts are happening during COVID. And this got started because I've been interested in this for a while, as many of my students in this webinar know, because I've been asking questions about how we estimate the size of crowds for the last couple of years, going all the way back to some early studies where I used drones to estimate the size of crowds, and then published some articles on it, and then went on to write a book about how we can democratize surveillance, essentially shifting power into the hands of people as we ask new questions about what collective action looks like in an age of surveillance and this sort of thing. So I'm already like primed to be interested in some of these puzzles, and then to already have a gang of folks on Twitter who I'm interested in asking questions with and poking around at stuff with. So I asked this question on Twitter. This like whole project got its start, or this vein of the project got its start on Twitter, because I asked what novel forms of collective action are happening, right? Is there new stuff that's happening? Does new ways of organizing ourselves socially lead to new forms of collective action? Do we do the same stuff we've always done? Because I'm interested in how new moments create new opportunities for agency, and we also see times when like some things are the same old. So what changes? So it started out as a simple tweet, and then that got the attention of other colleagues, including Felipe, who I've known for the last 5 years, and Jeremy Pressman and Erica Chenoweth. Many of you have read Erica Chenoweth's work. She's a leading scholar in this field. And they were already running something called the Crowd Counting Consortium, where after the Women's March in 2017, they were trying to estimate, well, how many people showed up for that? All of a sudden, we've got people turning up for something that was really a celebration of and effort to recognize women's voices that took a whole new sort of took on a whole new urgency after the 2016 election. So they were counting crowds since 2016. I've been counting crowds using drones since 2015. So it made sense for us to get together. So here's what we did. We looked at their data, which is all based on the US, and looking at events that are happening in the US and are then pooled into this one large crowd counting sort of consortium database. And Felipe and I came along and said 2 questions. What happens if we look internationally? Because if you look at some of these heat maps, it's all focused on the US. Great data, but just on the US. So what happens if we go global? And what happens if we really drill down into what's happening in this sort of unprecedented moment that we're in? So that led us to scrape the web for all sorts of events and all sorts of activities, and to then invite people. You can go and submit your own records here, and it'll go into our archive. And this really led to us having something like now 120, 130 forms of collective action. The big picture, then I'm going to stop talking. The big picture here is that the activities are all over the political spectrum, but they tend to be predominantly are nonviolent. So almost hardly any violence. The same thing we found when I did a large study with some folks who are on this call right here with students of mine about how drones are used. Most of the use is nonviolence. And so I'm happy to see that trend again. Lots of people on the streets, lots of people at home, but predominantly nonviolent. That's sort of how we got started. And I think what's going to happen next is we're going to go sort of back and forth, Felipe and I, for the next, I think, 15 or so minutes, and sort of unpack some of what came out of that data. So I guess, Felipe, for you, you're in the middle of a big study that's looking at social movements, and then we pulled all this data. What in the data was surprising to you? What did you find that was interesting?
Yeah, what I found that was really interesting, and also I must say very cool, is 2 things, right? The first one is how much humans are able to innovate, right? And also like the ways in which we innovate, because many times when we think about innovation, we think about the kind of stuff that you, Austin, studied, right? Like how do we use technology to achieve new things? How do we improve some things? And thinking about technological innovations. But this time, innovations were many times just taking a piece of chalk and making lines on the street, right? I'm speaking about, okay, when we think about demonstrations and protests, how do we make sure that protesters are safe and also they fulfill the legal requirements to protest to keep distance among each other? And there are all these cool pictures about these protests in Tel Aviv, for example, in Israel, in which organizers, they make these spaces just drawn with chalk, so people knew where they had to stay to keep the distance, right? Also, something that I found very impressive is how connected we are in this world, right? And how these different innovations, they transmitted from one country to another really, really quick, right? I don't know if that's something that happens in the US, but here in Europe, right, every night, every evening at 8 p.m., people go out on their windows, people go out on the balconies or on their doors, and they start clapping for health workers. And this is something that started in Italy, and it just spread all around Europe. So it's happening in Spain, happens here in the UK. And I think that this kind of transmission of tactics, this diffusion of tactics and like cool things to do, it's amazing. It shows us how connected we are, even if we are like very far from each other. So that's something that I really enjoy looking at. So what about you, Austin? Like, which kind of big trends did you see in the data?
So yes, that's a great question, because we've got all of these like different examples that come to mind when we think of this moment we're in. And I think what we're trying to do right now, Felipe and I and our colleagues, is ask new questions about like, so what does it mean? Is there diffusion? What kind of use like is the most popular, or the most kind of like the kind of protest that's most popular? So the first thing we're seeing right away is that there's two big differences. There's online activity and there's offline activity. And offline activity is, I don't need to tell you, it's like rent strikes, the sort of thing Felipe may talk about in a little bit, mutual aid pods, balcony concerts, anything where essentially people are doing stuff in real time, in real life with each other. And then of course there's, as there has been over the last 10 or 15 years, this explosion of online activity, people using hashtags like COVIDiots and flattening the curve and stay safe at home, digital town halls, petitions, webinars like this one, a whole bunch of new activity as people are trying to do the old stuff online or new stuff online. And so that's led to a whole bunch of innovation. One thing that was surprising to me was that offline activity in this data was twice as popular as online activity. So what it means is that people are doing stuff that's like, mutual aid, or people doing things that are in solidarity, or 2 meter apart protests, or kind of solidarity marches, or caravans, or whatever. These are the things that are really predominating, these sort of like offline activities. And also, and I mentioned this earlier, overwhelmingly nonviolent. And so when you go through the data, there's like nonviolent, if this is like all of our data, nonviolent is here. And there's this little bit that's not violent, but mixed. And an example of mixed is, for example, in Brazil, gangs are actually going through and enforcing stay-at-home orders inside favelas because the Brazilian government isn't. So you have gangs doing this sort of local enforcement of social distancing because the government has actually fallen down on its job. So, and then I think there's a bunch more stuff to say, but one thing I've been really fascinated by is, the saying, the personal is political, this idea that how we show up in life, in our everyday life, the way we use pronouns, the way we dress, the way we sit in rooms, all have like political implications, political connotations. This is like hyperdrive to that personal is political. All of a sudden, wearing a mask or not wearing a mask is a political symbol. Going out for a walk in certain times in certain places is a political gesture. And so I saw on Twitter yesterday, somebody said, how is it only me, or when I see somebody walking down the street and they're wearing a mask, I assume they're a Democrat? And that's like hyperbole, but it really has like emphasized the fact that there are these like personal, like the personal politics of the moment are actually getting sort of accelerated and exacerbated. So I'm curious also, and we don't have data on this yet, but where is innovation in this space? Felipe said, is this diffusing? Where do things diffuse? How is it that like all of a sudden wearing a mask went from a public safety thing to a politics thing? That's a hunch, it's a hypothesis. Does the data support it? And if it is supported by the data, like how the heck did that happen? So these are the sorts of things that we're seeing, lots of offline and online, but most of it is actually offline, people in real life, in real time doing things. Most of it's been nonviolent, and actually where we do see, and we haven't seen any cases of violence actually. We see just a handful of like mix, like this instance from favelas. So I think I'm going to end there because there's lots of other things that I think are interesting here, but we've only got so much time. I guess the question about trends goes back to you, Felipe, because you were actually looking at data on like social engagement and protests and politics before COVID, right? And then has that study continued? Can you tell us a bit about what's happening there and what you're finding?
Yeah, so I'm part of this multi-million research project here in the University of Manchester, in which we're collaborating with colleagues all around Europe. And we are studying basically how people react to moments of crisis. And this project started much earlier than COVID. And we want to understand, okay, when do people do nothing? When do people take to the streets and protest? And when do people give up, or not give up, but they take another option and they decide to migrate? And which factor do they influence in this decision? And we were running some surveys, national representative surveys in different countries. And what happened is that while we were running our survey in Argentina, which is one of our cases, COVID happened, right? So we have this very cool data in which part of the people are surveyed before the first COVID case arrived to Argentina, and also before the lockdown measures. And then we have another part of data that was done through telephone interviews in which people are surveyed after lockdown. So this is what we call a natural experiment, right? So you have people who are, there are no reasons to think that they're different, and the only difference is COVID, right? So what we can assume is that the difference among these two groups are motivated by COVID. And then we started asking questions about what we can think about with this data. And something that was very surprising is that people are still willing to protest regardless of COVID. And this is something that also we have the confirmation from other survey we have in Ukraine, in which we add COVID-specific questions. And you can see that it's not only that people are still willing to engage in protests because like after COVID, but also when you control for data about how scared people are about getting infected by COVID, they're still willing to protest. So in Argentina, which is a really mobilized society, there are like around 55% of respondents who say that they're still willing to take to the streets and protest against the government. And in Ukraine, which is not as mobilized as Argentina, it's around 45%. And the difference are not as big between the pre-COVID people and the post-COVID people. So this is amazing. And I think that this also has to do with what we were speaking about innovations before, right? Because you innovate when you really want to do something. And we people really want to protest still. And we're this protests against lockdown. We're seeing all these mobilizations, breaking lockdown rules, which show the motivation to protest, regardless of one agrees with the motive of the protest or not. And we see that people who want to protest, they innovate and they make protest happen. And I think this is a very cool thing, because we've seen it before also with protests against autocratic government, in which people take to the streets regardless of repression. But we also see that in moments of a pandemic, people find ways to protest because people still want to express their opinions and their political sentiments on the streets. So what about the US? What did you find there, Austin?
Yeah, the US is such I'm still like flipping through and seeing who else here, and I see like folks from, you know, I'm affiliated with a university in the UK where we're working with Benjamin Lucas and Matthew Voits on like analyzing this data, and I see colleagues and friends from Hungary, and so it's interesting to try to explain the American context outside the American context, and it's like always helpful to start with this idea that America is not one country. It's actually, you know, several different countries bolted together. And as a Californian, I think it's like California is one country, then there's the rest of the country, or maybe there's just like 6 countries. I used to assign students the job of like figuring out how many different like actual political regions America is. And it's not 50 and it's not 1, it's something in between. So asking a question about like America and what's happening in the States is like really, really sort of complicated, because it's because of pre-existing, you know, America's a pre-existing condition, you know, which is rampant racism and inequality and political cleavages and a lack of sort of solidarity at a national level that would help us to sort of overcome a hurdle like this one. So so when I went and looked at the data, to answer your question specifically, looking at your data, I think, and again, like a lot of this is hypotheses. I hope we don't, are we recording this, you know, because we're going to be wrong in like a year when we really run the data. But the early hypotheses that I'm generating out of this are that there was really a first wave of solidarity where people are doing really solidaristic things, staying home, you know, the kind of clapping sort of activities you've described. I have a friend who like runs a dojo, and all of his students came by his house as he was like, you know, in appreciation of him as like a teacher. So I feel like there's all of these, you know, ways we're pivoting and managing, and a lot of them are solidaristic. But I think we're in this moment now where we're starting to turn into a second round of activity, which is where folks are either upset about the status quo as it was before COVID, right, in America, inequality and racism, or are frustrated with the new status quo, which is sheltering in place and trying to flatten the curve. And in both cases, there are deep political critiques of the old status quo or the new status quo that I think can lead to additional mobilization that is less solidaristic and is instead based on like America's pre-existing conditions, you know, which I've already mentioned. So I think the big puzzle is looking, first of all, at what brought people together, if I'm right, what brought people together in that first round, and then how can we do more of that as we head into an uncertain future. So that's not an answer. It's more like a series of questions and hypotheses that I think I think our team are going to be leaning into as we start to unpack this data. I'm supposed to ask you a question. So what's all of this mean in the places you're watching? I mean, I feel like you're a Spanish citizen, so I'm gonna out you for a bunch of things. You're a Spanish citizen. You and I know each other from our time at Central European University in Budapest, which is like this really wonderful bastion of civil society in Hungary before it got kicked out and sent to Austria. You are also living and working in the UK. And then you've got these studies you just described in Argentina and Ukraine. So like, I don't know, pick one place, and then what does this mean what does COVID mean for the places you're studying collective action?
Yeah, well, as you know, well, I'm also very interested, not only social movement, but in housing and housing movements. And I think that this pandemic has meant a lot also for housing, right? Because it's like housing is the place, our homes, where we now protect ourselves from the pandemic, right? But what happens to those who have precarious housing conditions, or what happens to those who don't have a home to protect themselves from the virus, right? So I think that something that happened there in Spain, but I also believe in the US, is like a huge spike on rent strikes. I know that in New York, like there is the biggest rent strike in the more than a century, and in the case of Spain, is pretty much the same. And I've got this friend who's actually coordinating the global part of the rent strike, who was telling me about these things and about the discussions that they had when COVID happened, right? And for me, it was amazing how, again, on the topic of innovation, how activists and organizers and other people are always able to find opportunities, even in these horrible situations, right? And the discussions they were having. And even if they were, like in Madrid, in Barcelona, in many other cities in Spain, just in the US, rent prices are skyrocketing, and it's very difficult to afford living by your own. It's very difficult to afford even finding a room in many places. So there was always this idea among housing activists about organizing a rent strike. But what happens with the rent strike? First, for framing, it's very difficult to organize it because, you're basically saying, I'm not paying my rent. Sometimes the landlord is a big landlord, right? So, I mean, you would not put that person or that company into a financial troubles, but sometimes it might be an individual person who needs that money for something else. So it's something that is very difficult to frame and to send a message that public opinion can understand. And also it's something that's very scary, right? Because when you engage in this type of political activism, you're basically putting your home at risk. If you don't pay your rent, they might kick you out of your home. So it's something that is very, very risky. And how this pandemic and the change that it brought led many people to engage into that type of actions. First, because many people in public opinion who are probably not politicized, they understood the importance of having a home and how difficult it is to pay a home. And especially now when many people stop working because of the pandemic, how difficult it is to pay a rent. And also because there were all these changes in which civil courts closed, so they cannot start eviction procedures against people. So activists won a lot of time to get ready for when all these civil court cases will start and for when evictions will happen, to get ready for that, organize, be prepared, and be able to defend themselves. And I think that it's amazing because in Spain, you have tens of thousands of people who engage in this rent strike. Similarly happens, like I know in New York is a big thing. I also know that in San Francisco, it's a lot of things going on. So I think that also thinking about these ways of engaging in activism in which you don't need to go to the street, right? So instead of going outside and protesting and making your point, what you're doing is like, no, I'm withholding from the system. I'm not participating in this accumulation, but I'm making also my political point that rents are so expensive. And they're very difficult to afford. So I think that, like, to me, this was one of the things that I found the most fascinating. But I don't know, what about you, Austin?
I get the thing you just said. It makes me wonder if this is going to fundamentally change the conversation about slacktivism, you know, for the next decade or so. So there's been this like raging debate in the social sciences about whether or not online activity really matters. And so up through the Arab sort of spring / Arab uprising, there was this sense that technology was this other thing. It didn't really matter. And then all of a sudden, you know, folks are actually, it can be this huge mobilizing effect. People can be using all sorts of technologies and techniques for networking that are sub rosa and not newspapers and not the radio, and people can do directly. And this raised about, you know, the last 10 years we've been debating that as social scientists, and critics have said it's one thing to actually click I'm interested on Facebook, and it's quite another to show up for the revolution, because one of them is actually easy to do, it costs you nothing, and some emerging science suggests we get the same dopamine drop in our brain if we do that. So kind of like saying I'm going to be there and actually going there, you get like one hit of dopamine, and all the rest of what the difference is really in solidarity and in showing up and in longer term networks, and in the fact that, like, you know, Felipe and I could talk later, man, we were there in the movement or whatever. But in fact, in the actual here and now, clicking like I like something or retweeting something may actually do the same thing for us psychologically and in terms of like our social ethics, as does showing up on purpose in a solidaristic and possibly sacrificial way for people who are like us or not like us with some sort of greater cause. So that's a kind of like a mini, like too long didn't read literature review of what the debate has been in my world. The funny thing is that now, just to take Felipe's point, he's right there on my screen, by the way, just to take Felipe's point, wherever he is, this right now, since so much of this activity is actually hybrid or online and offline, or it's offline because of an online thing, it may be that we're going to be unpacking some of these assumptions for quite a while. So that's like me saying to you, Felipe, like, gosh, I don't know. Looking forward, though, I think there's going to be, and I think this is my last comment, then I hope we've got time we can throw it open for questions. But I think looking forward, the big puzzle for me is what kind of lessons are going to be learned by whom and with what sort of moral to the story we're gonna walk away with, what sort of plan of action. Because if you think that in general, countries could have done better at moving a little faster and being a little bit better coordinated, and that what we need is some tweaking around the margins and some reforms of our, you know, at the national level. Felipe and I both sort of think internationally. So if you want to think about the state by state or nation state by nation state, we need some tweaks and to figure out, well, who had best practices and who can we learn from, and how can we have a global or national consortium of actors and an early warning system. And we think about this sort of like as a pandemic policy moment, then our lessons from this are going to be fairly contained. We're going to learn some fairly modest lessons. But if the takeaway is that we do not have systems, I would argue in the United States, we don't have systems that serve everybody. I would argue that America is not a nation state. America is a different sort of place in which is organized around the systematic marginalization of some people. Then this is actually a stress test of a system that actually suggests and shows to demonstrates to everybody how the system really works, which is that it works for a few people who can sit with books behind them on a Zoom call with the door closed. And it doesn't work for millions and millions and millions, tens of millions of people in the United States, and hundreds of millions of people, probably 1 billion people globally. So we're having a big conversation about how great it is that the air is clean and that we might actually, you know, hit some larger objectives around climate change and pollution, you know, by 2030, we're going to have a similar conversation about whether or not we're having setbacks around a billion or so people slipping back into like sub-dollar a day poverty. So we're gonna have some really big conversations about whether we've created economies and societies that care for people, and whether or not, when we say we, as in like we the people or whatever your national creed is, whether or not we actually have everybody in mind when we use those pronouns. And so for me, I think just moving forward, what I'm hoping is that in all of this activity, a larger conversation emerges about how, whether it's the UK, Spain, the United States, does a better job at taking care of everybody, regardless of race, creed, color, or amount of capital. And I think that's the challenge. But that's not like a, oh, I've run the equation and here it is. That's not a finding from the data. That's much more of like a challenge for us as we lean into these moments and try to make what are really very, very difficult and dangerous disasters into opportunities for change that benefit everybody. And that takes like creativity and innovation. So I'm sort of a wait and see on what the lesson is, but really optimistic about what can happen if we come out the other end with an analysis that leads to action, and action that benefits everybody. That's enough monologuing for me. I think we have questions. Who do I toss to? Krista, you are a question goddess. Thank you.
Yeah, you can toss it to me. Thank you, Austin and Felipe. As a reminder to our audience, all participants are muted to ask a question, and many of you are doing this already, but go ahead and use the chat box you see at the bottom of the screen, and I'm going to toss them back over to Austin and Felipe here. So we've got one to start off with. We actually had one around, somebody wanted to know if you were all pessimistic or optimistic, but I think you just answered that one by saying you were optimistic. But if there's more that you want to say on that, you can do that. And then another question is, you mentioned that you found 100 distinct types of collective action. What are some of the most unique examples, methods that maybe we aren't hearing so much about, but are really innovative?
Felipe, why don't you take the optimistic, pessimistic, and I'm going to look at the spreadsheet real quickly.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm also quite optimistic about the afterwards of this pandemic, because I think that what it has shown us is that we are connected to each other, right? That like this discourse of the independent individual that does not depend on society, that doesn't work, that maybe I'm not going to get sick, or maybe if I'm sick because I'm young and I'm strong, I'm not going to have a bad moment. But I have a responsibility not to pass COVID-19 to other people, right? And I think that this has a connection that I hope that will prevail for many other issues, such as what Austin was saying about climate change, right? So we have a responsibility to each other in this regard. And then also, I think that another change that COVID brought is that it showed us the importance of social services and having strong institutions that work for everyone, right? So in the case of Europe, you know, free healthcare for everyone, it's important that it's affordable, and people now have realized about the importance of having a strong healthcare system that is accessible to everyone. I think it's the same in the United States, that people have realized that it doesn't only work if you've got your private insurance, which is great, and you have a great coverage, but if other people who cannot afford the insurance get sick, you're in risk as well. So, I mean, this social connection and this human connection that we have to each other, I think that the pandemic has brought it. From the perspective of housing, again, I mean, we have seen that there are certain things that they are so basic for human life that they should not only follow the rules of the market, right? It should not only depend on whether you've been lucky enough to have your life going in a way that you've got a good job and you're able to afford all those books that are in the back of many people when they talk on Zoom. But it's also that, you know, like we need some things because we're human beings and everyone deserves a dignified life. So I think that this has permeated in for many people, and I think that it opens the opportunity for many more movements and politics that seek social justice to be stronger and appear on the agenda after the pandemic.
Okay, and that's perfect because now I'm going to answer the. I've got this spreadsheet in front of me. Please forgive me for like it looks like I'm reading because I really am. So it's like 140 different kinds of activities that we've tracked. So like 140 methods, 138 methods. For those of you who are peace studies sort of folks, this came from this early idea from Erica Chenoweth that like, what if we were to update Gene Sharp's like 198 tactics for nonviolent protest. So this is a pivot off of that. So here's some of them. So prison protest, the rise of alternative schools. One that surprised me has been the car caravan. Everybody's seen it, but that was really like surprising to me as sort of a counter protest. People protesting on bikes, mutual aid pods, which I mentioned, but people putting together like care packages and delivering them. People putting stuff in their windows, teddy bears, rainbows, that sort of thing. That's super unexpected. People painting their doors. People who are taking traveling spray paint stenciling, sort of setups and doing spray paint stencils. People are developing code words. I didn't enter this one in. One of our enumerators did, but it is item number 88, collective howling. I don't know what that is, but I want to know more. Solidarity baskets, video game protests, people organizing in the chat functions of video games, pirate radio, photo projections, people actually using projectors to display images on like political images onto buildings. So this is just like my quick pull through of a couple that were surprising to me, and every one of those represents, I mean, this is like to echo a theme, I guess, that's emerging. Like none of those are like, I've never heard of anything like that. They're like really interesting pivots off of something we already do. What do? Protest out front? Let's get in the car. We can do a social distance protest or celebration. So this is one of the things I suspect we're going to find more of as we look for tactical innovation, is people taking something they'd already seen before, pivoting off of it slightly in order to meet the needs of the day in solidarity or in protest. And so I think that's, but the answer is those are some of the quirky and weird ones. If I find more, I'll send them to you, Beth.
Great. And actually on that topic, we got two add-ons to this particular topic is people who would appreciate having a list of those 140 methods. So if there's a place that they can go to get that, and then what were your research parameters for defining something as collective action in this study?
So two answers to this. The first is this is an open, all of this stuff is 100% open. Anybody who's ever worked with me before knows all my stuff is open. Open access, open data, open everything. There's a link to a Google Doc, an open Google Doc in the chat right now. You can go there and you can see, it'll say like, Austin Choi-Fitzpatrick is editing this document. That's the document we're using. And you can actually feed into that. We have a form that you can use to feed into that, and I'll drop that in the text in a minute. The answer to, what was the other question? The other question was, what's our parameters for this? We have gone through with the broadest possible parameters. And the parameters are they people working on purpose for some sort of like, on purpose for a purpose? And this is meant to then not crowd out people who are doing things like sewing masks, because this is something that is solidaristic. Oftentimes it's coordinated with others, and it doesn't look like protest, but it actually is something that's done with a particular aim in mind. We also haven't screened out people based on political preference. So both Felipe and I are social movement scholars. The thing we're looking for is not progressive political engagement. It's when do people get together to make change, and that can be they can be the initiators of change. It can be trying to fight the change. So definitely what got coded was those folks in Michigan who are trying to open the state back up. That is intentional collective action, and it was all nonviolent. So this stuff gets mapped in a fairly broad way, and then later we kind of boil it down to analyze it. So a lot of that happens after the fact.
Great. And then folks want to know, this is like a two-part question. What role does leadership have in these examples of collective action? So, and then somebody added on, new technologies provide a great space for decentralized collective action. Are these movements led by individuals? Are they decentralized? Are you seeing any patterns related to leadership and the specific categories of activism?
Felipe, can I toss that to you based on your fieldwork in Spain?
Yeah, sure. So I think that leadership plays a very important role, maybe from the perspective of inspiration, right? So like many of these actions have started with a few people doing something, a few people sewing some mask, or some social centers in Spain 3D printing some mask for health workers, right? But they have inspired other people to engage into those type of actions. And I think this type of inspiration is particularly important now, in which it's very difficult to gather together in a place. So many of the types of collective action that we see is not many people doing something exactly in the same place at the same time, but it's many people doing something separately, but with the same purpose, the same tactic, the same strategy. So I think that that perspective on leadership, I think is very important in there. Then on leadership of social movements, I think that some of those actions are definitely led by seasoned social movement organizers. Other actions, I think that they have been more spontaneous, but we also know from what we see, and also from the social movements literature, that even if actions seem spontaneous, they're not always spontaneous, or very few times are spontaneous, because organizers are constantly trying to look for other opportunities to make their case, to pull for their strategies, and to start getting more people engaged into their actions. So also that kind of background leadership, in which they, like again, being able to speak, to inspire, being ready to find the opportunity, to seek the opportunity, and like find the moment in which action should be taken. I think that has also been very important.
Okay, and we got time for a couple more here. One, this is a topic of several of these questions. What 3 to 5 collective actions are showing to be the most impactful in these times?
I'm going to leave it open for Felipe too, but I don't think we know, honestly. I mean, I think that there are these instances where a large, well-resourced movement will then, with a lot of energy and a lot of collective action, sort of push a particular policy issue forward, or really get behind a hashtag, for example, or sponsor with free staff the creation of some sort of nationwide, conversation or events. And I'm not seeing this in the data. It really has, because gathering is hard. And it's really hard to say, like, hey, why don't the 5 of us get together and then do something? And it's just, it's tough. And so I don't have the answer to that. But my suspicion is that, or my hunch is that we're going to see more and more of the kind of stuff that I read to you. And if you were listening to me earlier, you might be going like, oh, really? How often did that happen? And the answer may be it happened only like 3 or 4 times. And in fact, what we see is not these 5 big movement activities, protests, boycotts, these sort of big 5 that happened like 90% of the time. But in fact, maybe 95% of the time, it was just 100 other things that may not happen again, or 2 or 3 may get picked up as being more popular. So that's a lot of words to say, I don't know, but I'm a professor, so that's my Felipe?
Yeah, so I must agree with Austin. I think that it's a very good question, but it's such a great question that it's very difficult to answer, right? And it's a constant debate, not only among activists, but also among scholars about, okay, how do we measure impact of a social movement, right? I mean, is it changing the policy? Is it changing public opinion? Is it changing the lives of other people, right? So now, it's only 2 months that we see this type of mobilizations. It's very difficult to assess whether they will have a very big impact or not, right? We can say, for example, well, this collective clapping has been very impactful because, I'm sure that it has changed the opinion of many people, right? Because they have seen the importance of how other people care, right? But if we get into changing policies, I think it's a bit early to say. If we go to like changing the lives of activists or people participating there, I think it's a bit early to say. But also, I think that because there has been all these actions that have tried to make participation very easy and accessible for everyone, joining a Twitter campaign, doing these kind of things. Many times it might have been the first example of activism of somebody who hasn't been politicized. And that first example of activism can be very impactful because it might change their lives, because they might realize that they enjoy doing activism, they might start meeting other people, and they become actual activists that they will become very engaged later. So yes, again, so like I think that's very difficult to say now, but I think that many of these actions are going to be very impactful.
Great, thanks. Okay, I'm going to throw out 2 last quick questions and then we'll wrap this up. One, a variety of political positions have mobilized around the COVID pandemic moment. Have you noticed any particular differences between right-wing / pro-Trump and other activation in this moment? And then the second piece of that is, have you noticed trends in what media is showing? If you're showing like, here's the full spectrum, is there one section that media is highlighting?
I'm going to answer the first question for the US and then throw it to Felipe for other context. So this is a great question, and it's a strange time to be answering the question. So let's just take, for example, the well-publicized sort of militia protest in Michigan, where folks were demanding that the state reopen. So that was a lot of guys with balaclavas and machine guns and very intimidating looking, and we're doing something that all of us are sort of like generally horrified by, which is all meeting together and not socially distancing. So the interesting thing, if you delete the guns, which is a particularly American sort of idiosyncrasy, if you delete the guns, what they're doing is showing up in their protest garb, in their cultural garb, in order to have their voices heard in a legislative body or at a capitol. That's what protest movements have been doing for 200 years. That's like an old script. And so there's nothing interesting or innovative from like a theoretical perspective about that. Some people show up at, some people organize online. Some people show up at the, at the Capitol or the steps of the White House or that's not interesting or novel. What's interesting, novel all of a sudden is only some people will do that rather established kind of tactic right now. Does that make sense? So it's not at all surprising to see people turn up and say what they think in front of a hall of power, except showing up in large numbers is now something a whole group of people are unwilling to do. So the difference is in the claims, but also in the tactics. Some people are willing to use certain tactics. They're not new tactics, they're old tactics. And then in terms of I don't know, Felipe, do you have a sense of in other countries, whether or not there are differences?
I think that, that's something that I think it applies to the United States and also to other countries that, progressive movements or conservative movements, there are some like specific topics that are very likely to mobilize them, right? And for example, I think that in the case of conservative movements, is this very particular individualistic conception of freedom, right? So like people get to the streets because they want to be free. They want to be free to get a haircut. They want to be free to go walking around, right? So they don't enjoy the government telling them what to do. They don't enjoy the government telling them to stay at home. On the other hand of the spectrum, right, on the side of progressive social movements, social issues are much more mobilizing, right? Which is also another conception of freedom, if we can say about that, because I want to be free to be healthy, right? So there are issues related to, okay, we want people to have access to social services. We want people to have access to healthcare. We have problems with housing. So I think that there are different issues that mobilize different ideologies. And the pandemic is so huge that, of course, has affected everyone. And any ideology can find a reason to mobilize.
Great. Thank you. Well, there are still so many questions in the chat box, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them today. We're going to end here. Austin and Felipe, thank you for sharing your work with us. It's so interesting to get a real-time picture from around the world, and even in the chat box. Thank you everybody who was sharing different things there. We encourage all participants to share this webinar with friends and family, and we'll be following up with a YouTube video link. That follow-up will also have links to join both the Kroc School newsletter and the San Diego Diplomacy Council newsletter if you're interested and do not already receive them. Thank you for your partnership, San Diego Diplomacy Council, and thank you all for joining Kroc at a Distance. Have a wonderful rest of your day.